day it is to come together to worship God, to sing His praises. Those are some wonderful songs Les led for us this morning. The Thomas song, hopefully maybe y'all have heard that before. I know obviously some of you have. I think it's a wonderful song. We do have a similar song in our songbook that I love, that I wish that we would sing. We've not sang it since I've been here. I don't know if we know it here or not. But it's also called it's about Thomas. These things did Thomas count as real. Les, you need to learn that one because it's pretty amazing too. I may have one time actually read the words of that song. It's a beautiful song. But what a wonderful time to be here, to be together. If you're visiting with us, we want you to know that you are welcome and wanted here at the Brighton Church of Christ. If you're looking for a church family to identify with, look no further than this group of people. These are ones that love the Lord, that live every single day to draw closer and closer to God and seek that heavenly way and help one another get there. And that's one of the best things about a church family, is that we're helping each other get to the goal of heaven itself. When I get flowers, I practice floral dyeing. That is, they come into my possession and they die. But there's actually a practice among florists called floral dyeing, D-Y-E-I-N-G, dyeing flowers. It's where they put a flower with a cut stem into a cup or a bowl of colored water, usually food coloring or some sort of dye, and they allow the flower to begin to soak that moisture, the water up through the stem, and as it does draw that moisture up, it draws up the color as well. And eventually, the petals of the flower will turn the color of the dye that is in the water. It's pretty amazing. You can make some pretty unusual colors, unnatural colors, things that you wouldn't normally see in nature, or even greater saturations of certain colors. And it helps florists to match such things as wedding colors. You know, whenever you're having a wedding, a lot of times women, as they're planning out their weddings, they have this idea in their mind that their colors are going to be, burgundy and silver or something like that. And so they want their flowers to be that saturated burgundy color. Well, a florist can do that. You can use that flower dyeing process to match school colors for homecoming events or something like that, or even holiday colors. You've seen really green flowers maybe for St. Patrick's Day, or maybe you've seen the red, white, and blue flowers that are oversaturated in their colors for the 4th of July and things like that. It all happens because the flowers themselves absorb the environment. They take in the environment and it changes the flower. You know, Christians are sometimes like those flowers. They absorb their environments. We're in a world that is, by Christ's own admission, is going to hate you, John chapter 15, verses 18 and 19. It's not always pleasant to think about the world hating us, and yet Jesus promises that it will. Why? Because you are not of the world. I've chosen you out of the world. But sadly, some Christians continue to stay in the world and they absorb their environments. They adopt human philosophies. They adopt political maneuvers for the church, as if the church is some democracy or some monarchy or some dictatorship, and that's how decisions are made. The church has a different style of government itself. They buy into the nationalistic ideas. You know, we're not just the Church of Christ, we are the American Church of Christ. Or worse, they absorb the sin and the skepticism and the selfishness of the world. During Jesus' excursion that we saw last week into the Gentile world, beginning there in Mark chapter 7, we see that he casts out a demon for the Syrophoenician woman, which we focused on last week. We skipped over the story of the deaf man who comes to Jesus, and Jesus, sticks his fingers in the air and spits on the ground and touches his tongue. Some of the rituals of the miracles are a little bit disconcerting. I can't imagine Jesus saying to the man, okay, now stick out your tongue and then touch. I don't want to touch my own tongue, much less a stranger's tongue. But that's what Jesus does, and he cries out, Ephphatha, which is, be opened. He also feeds another great multitude, this time of Gentiles, 4,000 men, it says. And so, this is with these 7 loaves. So though Mark does not record any actual teaching of Jesus during this Gentile excursion, we understand that Jesus' presence there and his work and the miracles there begins to open the hearts and the minds of the Gentiles, preparing them for the salvation that was coming. Now, ultimately, we find that it comes to fruition in Acts chapter 10 with the household of Cornelius. But the foundation is already being laid here with Jesus as he's going through Tyre and Sidon and the Decapolis and the cities of the Gentiles. But after the excursion, he comes back and he gets in the boat, and it says in Mark chapter 8 and in verse 11 or verse 10, that he comes back to the city or the district of Dalmathuna. Now that's a strange name for us because it's not used anywhere else in the New Testament. It's not used anywhere else in ancient writings. There is no record of a town or a city or a district or anything by this name. Some translations today, while the evidence of the manuscripts support Dalmathuna, some have been changed in later dates to Magadan or Magdala so that it would fit together with maybe what Matthew was saying and things like that. What we have found, though, is that at Magdala, the city itself or the synagogue itself was about 150 yards or so from the shoreline. When you get out to the shoreline, there are breakers, man-made breakers that would break up the waves and keep it from being too much turmoil on the sea near the city itself. And they would anchor their boats there at those breakers. There has been found evidence that possibly that anchorage spot of Magdala was Dalmathuna. They have found the letters D-A-L on a broken piece, I believe, of stone in that particular area. And some have suggested maybe that was Dalmathuna. For all we can tell that it probably is, Matthew would tell us or identifies this as Magdala, and it would be easy to see that, here's the town or the synagogue. About 100 yards away is the anchorage spot. It's not unusual for towns to have that. And so Jesus comes to Dalmathuna, a Galilean port near Magdala. And the excursion itself is sandwiched between 2 episodes of Jesus with the Pharisees. The first one we saw a couple of weeks ago when Jesus is challenging them about their traditions. You have a fine way of rejecting the word of God with your traditions. And he comes back, and the first thing they want is a sign. And so we're going to join Mark this morning in chapter 8 as Jesus clashes with the Jewish leaders in Galilee and warns the disciples about influence. And it begins with finding faith. Where does faith come from? As we begin searching this world and we're looking for reasons to believe, what creates faith? The Pharisees and the scribes and those who were opposed to Jesus had already made up their mind that they were not going to believe in Jesus. No matter what Jesus did, they had seen the miracles, they had heard the teaching. No matter what they did or what he did, they were not going to believe. But now they come to Jesus and they said that they seek a sign from heaven. That's what they want. They want this sign from heaven, but Jesus says they will not receive one. In fact, Jesus makes some of the most emphatic statements in the book of Mark, saying that they will not receive one. He begins by saying, "Truly I say to you," or some translations, "I tell you the truth." This statement is only used by Jesus one other time before this, and it's in Mark chapter 3 and verse 22, when the scribes that have come up from Jerusalem begin to challenge him, and they say that he casts out demons by the power of Beelzebub. And of course, Jesus is giving the emphatic denial. That's not the way it is. I tell you the truth, or truly I say to you. It's the most emphatic words that he can use to deny that his power is the power of the devil. Of course, he goes on to show that logically it doesn't make sense that it would be by the power of the devil, and he defeats the arguments and kind of sends the scribes and the Pharisees running away with their tail between their legs. But of course, they come back again. Jesus finishes that statement and he says that no sign will be given this generation. But literally, it's not captured so much in the English, but instead of using the negative "u," meaning not or no, he actually uses the conditional "eon," if. So it literally says, if a sign will be given this generation. Truly I say unto you, if a sign shall be given this generation. And you think, well, that's kind of awkward. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If, well, what's the condition? Well, it's actually not an if-then statement where there's a condition that must be met, then this would happen. But it's actually an old Semitic oath. It's as if Jesus is saying to them, I tell you the truth, if a sign is given to this generation, may I be struck dead. May God kill me now if a sign be given to this generation. The oath itself, pronouncing death or whatever it is, the emphatic statement, that is taken away or that is missing from this particular passage of it. But the awkward wording and you know what it seems to imply is that Jesus is stating in the most emphatic negative way possible, there will not ever be given a sign from heaven which they seek. It's important to understand that they are not asking to see a miracle. The book of John uses the word sign oftentimes to refer to miracles. But the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, do not use the word sign in reference to miracles. It's a different word. And so what they are asking for is something other than the miracles. They want a confirmation from heaven. They want the heavens to open and a light to shine around Jesus and a thundering voice come from heaven that says, this is my Son in whom I am well pleased. Listen. Wait a minute. They've already had the signs from heaven. But they discount it because of the hardness of their heart. You see, doubt is the one that asks for a sign. But there's a lot of problems when we start trying to create or find faith through signs like this. If doubt is the one that seeks for a sign from heaven, faith observes the teaching and the conduct of Jesus and chooses to believe that he is who he says he is. That's what faith is all about. The evidence of the miracles, the evidence of his teaching, the evidence of who he is enough to make some people say, you know what? This must be the Son of God. And I believe that. That's what faith is. Faith, of course, comes by hearing the word of God. Romans chapter 10 and verse 17. Jesus, as the communication of God to mankind, this discourse to man, he's bringing exactly that message that will bring faith, that will create faith. And that's what we want to see. Faith that comes by hearing, not faith that comes through a sign. You see, faith that is created without rational thought. That is, to see the evidence and come to the conclusion that, yes, I believe. That's a rational thought. If you don't have a faith that is based upon rationality, it is fickle and it will harden when things change or when the sign disappears. Oh, I'll believe if I can see a sign from heaven. Why not believe on the evidence that we already have? That's the great question. Faith that is created by a sign, we might say, cannot be passed to the next generation. Think about our call as Christians. We're to go out and preach the gospel into every living creature, right? We're trying to create faith in the hearts and the lives of those around us. And if my faith only comes from the fact that I saw a sign from heaven, how can I pass that to the next generation? Oh, you should have seen the sign that I saw? And what are they going to say? Well, show me the sign that you saw. You see, if our faith is based upon signs from heaven, and not the evidence which Jesus showed while he was on this earth, then we will not be able to pass that faith to the next generation, creating new Christians and followers of Christ. You know, there is plenty of evidence for the Jews to examine and to believe, but they refuse to look at the evidence. That's the whole point. It's not that they looked at the evidence and deemed it unworthy. It's that they haven't even looked at the evidence. There's a lot of people today who call themselves atheists. It's not because they looked at the evidence. It's because they're too lazy to believe in Jesus. See, Christianity is not a lazy lifestyle. Christianity demands something. Christianity is a life of action. And a lot of people don't want to do those actions. And so they stand back and say, you know what? I'm an atheist. Not a reasoned atheist, a lazy atheist. I submit that that's probably 90% of people who call themselves atheists today. The fact is, there was plenty of evidence, they just refused to look at it. David Garland, in his commentary on Mark, said, Jesus will offer this generation no noisy sign from heaven, only the wind whistling through an empty tomb after his crucifixion. Brother, that's all we need. That's it. We find faith in looking at the evidence of Christ in the world. It is not from signs from heaven. But what about keeping our faith? See, that to me is the next section. When we come down to verse 14 through 16, they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had brought only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. Jesus, it says that in verse 13 that he left them. He leaves the Pharisees. What's interesting here is that Mark uses again that rare but very emphatic cut off. That's what he did, is he went into the Gentile world. Remember the word which he used, he left there, and he uses that emphatic cut off. He cut them off and he goes into the Gentiles. Now he comes back and he meets with the Pharisees once again, and after they are refusing to believe, he left them. He cuts them off again. In fact, he will not contend with the Pharisees in Galilee anymore. This is it. He's done with them. You know that when Jesus sent them on the limited commission and he said, if any will not, or if a town will not receive you, what do? You wipe the dust or shake the dust off of your feet. You show that I'm done. I've done what I can do, and you refuse to believe. Jesus has done what he could do for the Pharisees, and they refuse to believe. Now the problem is he shows up with his disciples in the boat, and they're about to go out on the sea, and he sees the same kind of attitude in his disciples. The same hardness of their heart. And he's concerned about them. How can he keep them believing that he is the Son of God? So he leaves the Pharisees. He's getting in the boat, and the disciples come, and they're concerned about forgetting bread. Mark makes a comment here, though. He says that there's one loaf with them in the boat. That has caused us, when they say that there's no bread, and then Mark, in his commentary, says that there is one loaf of bread. Did they forget that they had the loaf of bread? Or maybe they think, well, that one loaf won't feed all of us. Or maybe, just maybe, Mark is pointing at something else. Maybe Mark realizes the one loaf is the bread of heaven. I am the bread come down from heaven, Jesus would say. Jesus himself confirms in verse 17 that they have no bread. So maybe Mark is contrasting what Jesus will say about the Pharisees and the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod with Jesus himself, who ought to be supplying their every need. He's simply reminding the readers that Jesus is that loaf. He is what supplies every one of us. I like the idea of that being the metaphor itself. Jesus interrupts their quandary with a warning when he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Jesus applies the idea of food, leaven, here to the Pharisees and Herod. And so it's not far-fetched to think that Mark is using bread here in reference to Jesus himself. But he uses the double warning, watch out and beware. It's not enough to just beware, nor not enough to just watch out. This is a very serious thing. Watch out and beware. Why? The Pharisees and Herod. Now we know Herod Antipas was the ruler at that time under the auspices of the Roman government. Didn't have a whole lot to do with the Pharisees. In fact, they had very little in common. They were at the complete opposite ends of the political spectrum. They were at the opposite ends of the religious spectrum, and yet Jesus lumps them together in the same loaf of bread here. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. So what is it that brings them together? What similarities do they share? Well, in chapter 6, the place where Mark deals with Herod hears about Jesus and he thinks what? This is John the Baptist come back to life. The evidence says it's something else, but Herod is not worried about the evidence. He's worried about John coming back and getting him. But he's ignoring the evidence. What are the Pharisees doing? We need a sign from heaven. All of these other things, that's not good enough for us. We need something bigger. We need something better. They, too, are ignoring the evidence. The disciples needed to protect their faith from hardening by ignoring or misunderstanding the evidence, just as Herod and the Pharisees had already done. They were in danger of doing the same thing. Well, how do we know that? Because they have no bread and they think, oh, we're sunk now. There's no hope for us because we don't have bread. Ignoring the very presence of Jesus in the boat with them. We keep our faith by not absorbing the waves of the world. You see, they were absorbing the ways of the world, what the world was saying, what Herod was saying, what the Pharisees were saying. It was starting to be absorbed. It was going up their stem and it's coloring their petals. They're changing based upon how the world is treating Jesus. Jesus sees it. Jesus is very concerned about it. And so he challenges their faith. Okay, well, let's look at this. Let's put this together. Let's put it to the test. How do we challenge our faith and reinvigorate it? Well, that's what Jesus is doing. You see, the problem was his disciples were losing their faith. They too had seen the miracles, but they did not understand. They were worried about bread. 3 times in the book of Mark, we find Jesus in the boat with his disciples, exasperated with their faith. The first time comes in chapter 4, when the storm has come upon the sea. Jesus had been sleeping in the boat, and they wake him up. Do you not care that we're going to perish? In chapter 4 and verse 40, after he has calmed the storms, he says, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? He's exasperated with them. You've already seen some amazing things. How come you cannot keep that faith going? The next time we find Jesus in the boat with his disciples, he's exasperated once again. He's walked on the water to get to them, and he gets in the boat with them. And it says that they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. In other words, they had already seen the feeding of the 5,000 multitude, and now they're in the midst of this storm, and Jesus comes to them on the water, and they're afraid. They're afraid because they hadn't put 2 and 2 together. They hadn't figured out what the feeding of the 5,000 meant about the power and the ability of Jesus. They hadn't realized that walking on the water shows that Jesus has power over the sea itself. They didn't understand. And now here, Jesus says in chapter 8 and verse 17, do you not yet perceive or understand? Jesus hits them with rapid-fire questions. He says, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you not see? Do you not hear? Do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of broken pieces did you take up? And the 7 for the 4,000, how many basketful of broken pieces did you take up? Do you not yet understand? It's interesting. In this whole exchange, Mark has Jesus only asking questions. He's giving them an opportunity of self-discovery. Is your heart becoming hard? Oh, no, Jesus, it's not. You know, that's what they wanted to say. But Jesus is not asking it for an answer. He's asking it for them to realize that their heart is becoming hardened. Do you have eyes and not see? Why can you not put these things together? You are the insiders. You're the ones that should know these things. By not understanding the full impact of the miracles, they were in danger of hardening their hearts. And by returning to his deeds and his teachings, Jesus is challenging them to reinvigorate their faith. Through the Bible, I see that faith is rarely static. The level of your faith today is not what it was last week. I don't know if it's up. I don't know if it's down. But faith is rarely static. It changes. It fluctuates. It fluctuates with how the world impacts us. It fluctuates with how much of the world we let into us, right? It changes with our circumstances. And so Jesus is challenging us, I think, to don't let the world influence you so that your faith wanes, so that it runs out, so that you lose your faith. Here's the great challenge. The constant conflict and doubt and challenge by the Jews seemed to wear on the disciples, much like it does on Christians today. Think about what we face, the idea of consensus science or normalization of immorality or hostility toward faith or equating Christianity with all other religions or those who are claiming Christians but living as the world, the false Christians. It all wears on our faith. The mockery, the ridicule, the books that are written, the movies, the science. The science, you turn on the TV and they start talking about science and 13 billion years and all these things that have been arrived by, not by evidence, but by consensus. We have enough people that agree on it. This is what we're going to teach is the truth. And so what do? We're in the world. Do we absorb it? Paul would say, therefore, go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord. Then I will welcome you. He's quoting from Isaiah 52. But the idea is that if we will separate ourselves, if we will not allow the world to influence us, the leaven of the world that wants to get into our lives, if we will block it out, then God will welcome us. As Jesus was preparing for the cross, he prayed that Lord's Prayer in John chapter 17. Ron made several references to it this morning. But he does say, I'm about to come back to you. I pray for those that I'm leaving behind in the world. The world is a dangerous place for faith. It is imperative that we protect our faith from the leaven of the world by constantly going back to the Word, by being reminded of His work and His watch care in our lives. As He watches your life, think about this. Answer these questions for yourself. As He watches your life today, is Jesus pleased with how you're living your life, or is He deeply sighing? Remember when the Pharisees asked for a sign? He deeply sighed. It's kind of the nadir of his ministry in Galilee itself. It's the lowest point. Now, when Jesus looks at your life, is he exasperated, disappointed, dismayed, deeply sighing that you spend another day hardening your heart by ignoring the evidence that leads to faith? Beware of the leaven in any form, whether it's the Pharisees or Herod or the world. Beware. Protect yourself against it. Accept his challenge. His challenge begins with becoming his child. If this morning you are not a child of God, do you want to be one? If you're not a Christian, if you've never obeyed the gospel, you're not a Christian. If you're not a Christian, you're not a child of God. It's not good to sit here and fool yourself into thinking, well, I think I'm good enough, or, well, I think I'm close enough. If you need to make a change, don't put it off. God is ready to receive you now. By obeying the gospel, you can be baptized for the remission of your sins, and God himself will add you to his church. And so the question comes, will you come as we stand and we sing this invitation?